the show in which we dig up sci-fi shows that no longer get or have never gotten the attention they deserve and attempt to bring them back into the light. This episode...
That's right, today we'll be looking at the classic 1939 Buck Rogers serial. The version I have is distributed across 2 different volumes on 2 separate VHSs, each one containing 6 episodes. And each episode features legendary sci-fi actor Buster Larry Crabbe starring as Buck Rogers, who had previously starred as Flash Gordon, 2 iconic sci-fi heroes played by one iconic sci-fi actor. You know you're in for a treat when you see that. The story follows a hero who crashed his airship, which was then quickly frozen over. The hero then stayed undiscovered for many years until he awoke in a strange future he did not recognize.
These 2 people have remained in a state of suspended animation for 500 years.
You've been asleep, Cap, for almost 70 years.
Well, that sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? But very minor similarities with the recent Captain America is not the reason that the 1939 Buck Rogers serial is, in my opinion, one of the most iconic pieces of sci-fi cinematography ever to be created. No, for me, this serial holds that title because it is both so influential and so influenced. There are throughout the film an array of sci-fi elements that have been adopted by and become quintessential elements of other, more recent and now famous sci-fi films. To name just a few of them, we can see a transporter lift which looks and functions quite similar to the one found on the Enterprise from Star Trek. We have phasers set to stun. We have mind-controlled zombies, which are referred to as robots. So that's 3 tropes ticked off in one. We have scrolling text which informs you of what happened in the previous episode. This is now synonymous with Star Wars, but here's Buck Rogers doing it in the 30s. There's a shot of Earth from space almost 30 years before the first actual shot of Earth from space. And while it was no secret what Earth from space would look like, it's exciting to see what was, at the time, realistic space travel. And as I'm sure you saw in the introduction, there's ship-to-ship combat, which if you've seen my Wing Commander video, is one of my favourite sci-fi elements. It also contains a fair share of the sci-fi tropes that were common at the time, such as the young boy and hero-friend dynamic and the strong female co-star, who turns out to be the only female in the entire film. Yes, there wasn't much equality in Hollywood back then, but luckily they've got better at it these days. Right, guys? Right. Now, I'm not saying that the 1939 Buck Rogers serial necessarily invented any of these. I'm honestly not sure how many of these sci-fi elements have appeared in previous films. It is, however, the largest concentration of sci-fi elements I've seen in a film this old. Which means if there is a larger concentration of sci-fi elements in an older film than this one, I've not seen it. So if you have seen it, feel free to mention it in the comments, and then I will be able to see it, which would just be fantabulous. So the story of the 1939 Buck Rogers serial is that Buck Rogers awakes in the future. He then instantly joins a rebel alliance who operate from within a hidden city. Their task is to take down an evil, oppressive empire. The empire is also hell-bent on finding the rebel base and destroying it. Now I know what you're all thinking, this story sounds a lot like Star Wars. Well, it does have a few shared elements with Star Wars, and I'm sure George Lucas probably watched Buck Rogers at some point in his life. But the story is actually quite different from Star Wars. The most obvious difference between the 2 films is that in Star Wars they're attempting to blow up the Death Star, whereas in Buck Rogers the rebels are actually trying to form an alliance with the Saturnians because they feel it will turn the tide of the war. They're not trying to destroy the Empire's city because they hope to liberate it. Throughout the serial, there's a back and forwards battle between the Empire and the rebels, who are both trying to convince the Saturnians that their side is the one that is morally right in the war. This leads to all sorts of interesting things like mind control and kidnapping and all sorts of fun stuff like that, which I won't go too far into, because then there would be no point of you going to see the film. Putting the storyline aside for a moment, let's just talk about the acting and the script, which surprisingly hold up quite well today. There is the occasional line or the occasional piece of acting that just is a bit off, but for the most part it stands up with, I would probably say, Star Trek or even The Twilight Zone. Speaking of Star Trek, you would feel like you're watching it by watching these fight scenes. Look at that brawler. I'd love to see Buck Rogers take on Captain Kirk any day. And as I'm sure you've noticed, the props, sets, and effects in this film still hold up extremely well today. For me, the city in the film both invokes thoughts of Metropolis and Coruscant. The hidden city manages to be believable as a mountainside with an opening door, which is just a testament to what the prop department has done with their miniatures. Speaking of miniatures, the miniature versions of the spaceships and their large-scale counterparts just look so alike that you believe it has just been flying. The only downside to the spaceships is I'm not quite fond of the noise they make. I suppose at the time making them sound like aeroplanes made them believable as flying machines, but these days it just sounds a bit strange. But of course nothing is perfect, and the Buck Rogers serial does have its fair share of downsides. Well, actually, to be honest, I only count 2 downsides. The first of these is that the storyline's a bit too repetitive. They crash their ship one too many times, and they have to go to Saturn one too many times, so by the 12th episode, it's a little bit repetitive. And the second of these is that 2 of the episodes concentrate largely on flashbacks. There's no place for a clip show in a 12-episode serial. Obviously, both of these flaws boil down to the same problem. The serial is just a little bit too long. If it was 9 or possibly 10 episodes, you would have not had to repeat story elements, and you definitely wouldn't have had to do a clip show. However, this is perhaps a sign of the times, because when the show was released, it was released in cinemas, and you would actually go and watch 1 episode a week. You wouldn't be watching 2 or 3 or even 4 episodes in a row like you can do now that you have the tape. If you were only watching 1 episode a week, I doubt you would have noticed the repetitiveness as much, and I doubt the clip show would have been as grinding. Still, I believe the serial could be quite well edited into a movie-length film, which it actually has been done, but it turned out terrible. What I'm referring to is the 1953 edit of the film Planet Outlaws, which replaces the first and very important setup scene with a strange man talking, which doesn't really add anything to the film. So I suppose what I'm saying is that this serial could do with a good edit, not that one. These small issues aside, however, I do of course recommend you watch the Buck Rogers serial. It wouldn't be on Sci Fi MineCart if I did not recommend it, and I wouldn't be gushing so much if I wasn't so fond of the film. If you enjoy old films, old sci-fi, or are just a big fan of sci-fi in general, you will definitely appreciate the 1939 Buck Rogers serial. And happily, if this video has piqued your interest, but your VHS player is no longer working, the film is apparently available both on the Internet Archive for free and on YouTube.
Thanks for watching. I have been and still am Grim Grindle.
I think this will work out perfectly. I don't get the idea. If they think he's a god, they'll obey him. And I can tell them what orders to give them.
I beg your pardon, General Solo, but that just wouldn't be proper.
A hidden city ship rising, sir. Trying to run our blockade.
Look! It's disappearing into thin air. It's vanished.
It can't have disappeared. No ship that small has a cloaking device.